Hello everyone, I'm Liz Haywood and welcome to this sew along for the beret. We're going to start right away by choosing a size, and you'll need a tape measure to measure your head, and preferably stand in front of a mirror like I am in the Haywood family bathroom. You want to take your tape measure and wrap it around your head so that it sits just above your eyebrows and it's level, and take a measurement in centimetres, and whatever your measurement is in centimetres, then that's the size you'll be making. If you are between sizes, don't worry, just go up to the next size, because the size can be adjusted with an interior ribbon in the beret. I'm now going to do a little fashion parade for you and show you some berets and talk about the kind of fabrics that you can use for this. This first beret is in a soft herringbone sort of tweedy type wool with linen binding, and and it's lined with satin inside. Wool makes a lovely soft beret. And this one is the opposite of soft. It's in a denim, which gives a much more, you can see it gives a much more structured shape. And it's it's bound with the same linen. And this beret is actually reversible, so you get two hats for the price of one. It's lined with Prince of Wales check. This beret has a ribbon through the binding so that it can be adjusted for your head size. So you may need that, or you may find you may not need it. But it gives a bit of flexibility with the sizing, because the thickness of the fabric that you choose and the binding and the lining thickness all affect slightly how the hat will fit. This next beret is linen, which works great for this pattern, and the whole thing is made of linen. It's self-lined and it has linen binding, which is the same linen for the binding on the other hats I just showed you. It works great in linen. I've made quite a few in these. Here is a beret made of I don't think it's wool, but it is some kind of suiting with a black binding, and it's lined in gingham, and this is a great example of how stripes and checks can work in this, because you can see that they can be matched to go round and round in like a sort of a hexagon formation. And this final hat is actually in a knit. I'll just show you before I put it on. It's what I would call a sweater knit, like a low stretch knit, and it's cut with the least amount of stretch going around the head, which is the opposite of how we normally cut knits. And it's given stability with a non-stretch lining. It's lined with cotton lawn, and it probably gives the softest shape of them all. Gives a very soft sort of silhouette. You can see with these that this beret is slightly bigger than your classic uniform type beret. It's more of a fashion beret, and you can really have some fun choosing some interesting fabrics for it. Well, let's get started. Print off your pattern and tape the two pieces together. And if you're using this pattern from Tauko magazine's pattern sheet at the back of the magazine, and you've got a tracing wheel off the pattern onto some cardboard, like cereal box weight cardboard, because then you'll have a much easier template to trace around when you're cutting out. Take an awl or a large darning needle and pop a hole in this dot on the side, and also the top of the dart point. It's just big enough so that you'll be able to fit a pencil through to mark when you're marking it out on the fabric. And on the pattern you can cut out your size, but if you want to save this for all the sizes, you could just fold up your size, which is what I'm going to do. You'll also need to mark the 2 points at the end of the dart as well. So I'm going to use this tool from my pattern making days, but you probably don't have one at home. But you can do just as good a job with scissors. Just cut a little gap big enough to get your pencil or some chalk in like that. When you go to mark your pattern onto the fabric, you'll need to have the fabric wrong side up and the pattern piece text side up. The reason the fabric is wrong side up is so that when you mark, you've got your dots on the wrong side of the fabric where you want them for sewing. You need 6 of these, all identical, nothing flipped. We'll be marking it out and then we'll be rotating and marking out. So you'll see the text side up the whole time. If you're using stripes or checks, but especially stripes, you want the stripes running parallel to this grain line. And that way you'll be able to have the stripes running around the centre of the hat like this. And for checks, either direction. I'll quickly show you how to match the checks for going around the hat, and then when we mark it out it will be the same as if you use for any fabric, checks or plains. So if you're using checks, pop a pin on a stripe, I'm just here, and sit the bottom of your pattern on the stripe and put a pin at the point like this. Then rotate this pattern like this so that this side angles on that pin, and see where it ends up. Mine ends up here. Take a measurement, which is about here, and then see, you want to fit that measurement between 2 checks. So in my case it fits perfectly between these yellow lines. So when I go to mark my pattern on the fabric, I'm just going to sit these on this yellow line as I go along. If you're cutting out a beret that's self-lined, then just keep marking so you've got 12 in a row. And if you're cutting multiple hats, you can just keep marking so that all the pieces are interlocked together. You can, if your lining is stable, you could slip it underneath this and cut them both out together. But I'm not going to do that because I'm using a satin for mine. So I'm going to cut this out now and then do the lining. Mark the bottom of the dart with snips, but tiny, like 3 millimeters or an eighth of an inch, because this edge is just bound. So let me show you how this pattern works. You know that these are cut this way, and then when they're formed into a hat, they are arranged like this. The short sides get put with the long sides like this. Like this, and then the darts and these seams are joined together, and that brings it in for around the head. When you cut out, don't forget to mark the bottom of the dart. Mark it with little snips, but really little, like 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch. Here's mine. There's one there. I'm going to cut the lining now, and the lining is cut in exactly the same way as the outer. So have the wrong side of your lining facing up, the text side of your pattern facing up, and mark in the same dart and the same dot on the side, so it's identical. But I'm going to cut my lining with a zero waste arrangement, which you might like to do. It's very good if you don't quite have enough fabric for the lining, or if your lining fabric's very light. And I don't advise it for thick fabrics because it puts an extra seam in there, but it's really great for lightweight fabrics and linings. So you'll need to cut a rectangle like this, that's the dimensions stated in the pattern, and then anywhere along here draw a diagonal line and use this as the guide for the angle. So do make sure you've got your wrong side of the fabric facing up and the text side of your pattern facing up. Then cut along this line. And swap these two pieces around like this. Okay, so now you've got a parallelogram, and you want to sew these together with a 1 centimetre seam and press the seam open, and then your pieces can be marked on like this and rotated and marked on like this. And here is the lining all marked in and cut out, and you can see that the seam will just land in a random place. And a little sewing tip for satins or very fine fabrics: when you sew them, if you're sewing like a straight grain seam, hold it taut as you sew and just let the sewing machine feed through of its own accord, and that way it won't bunch up and you'll end up with a very lovely smooth fine seam. I'm just jumping in here because I forgot to say you can also use this pattern piece as a conventional pattern piece. If you've got odd shaped scraps or you're cutting up clothes, you can just use it on its own. It's time to start sewing, and we need to begin by stay stitching the bottom of every panel. That's the side that's got the little notches on for the dart. If you're like me and you normally don't bother with stay stitching, do it this time, it's worth it. And it won't take you long because you're just going to run through on a long stitch, and if you stick your finger at the back of the foot like this, see how it sort of bunches up, and then just release it, and that way there's no danger of you stretching the fabric as you stitch. Let's do another one. So all 12 panels, the 6 lining and the 6 outside. It's time to sew the darts. Just bring your 2 notches together like this. You're going to stitch from the notches to that dot. Normally when we sew darts we make them a bit curved, so we end up with a very fine point at the dot, like for bust darts for example, but we don't want that this time. We want the dart to be ruler straight. So you could even do that as a guide, just draw a ruler line from notch to dot. And then when you press them that way. So they've pressed in that direction. Here are the darts pressed. It's okay that there's a gap here, like this, that it doesn't sit flush with this edge. That's fine. A little pressing tip. You can press this on a flat ironing board. if you just put the point of the iron into the dart and just hold this up. We are going to assemble the pieces now, and I'm going to start with the lining, and we will need to sew 3 together like this. Then we'll sew the other 3, and then we'll just sew them all the way through here. So let's start with the first pair. Lay this long side on top of the short side. We're going to stitch from the top down and pivot at this dot. So pop a pin in through the dot and then through where the stitching lines are going to crisscross. So the reason we gave you the dot is because this is quite a stretchy edge, and the dot will let you know where you are when you get down to here. So we're going to stitch down. When we get to the dot, we'll plunge the sewing machine needle in there and whip out the pin, and then we're going to get a pair of scissors and just snip halfway into the seam allowance, and that will let us pivot this piece around to finish sewing the end of the seam. So here's what it looks like sewn. Started at the top. Oh, by the way, I'm doing all the sewing in light grey thread so you can see what I'm doing. So we came down, here's where we pivoted, and see the little snip there? Then we rearranged the fabric under the sewing machine a foot and then came down to the end. Depending on what size you're doing, if you're doing a big size, you'll have a gap between the dart and the seam, and if you're doing smaller sizes, you'll actually have a tiny overlap. So this is size 56, so it's the third smallest size, and it about meets. And don't press this just yet. We'll press it after we've done the second seam. If your fabric's checked or stripes sewing these panels together, you need to give priority to the check or the stripe and ignore the dot. So start by matching the checks at the top, and the best way I know how is to put your thumbnail on the stitching line, flip that back and just move it to adjust, and then put a pin there, and then go along and do the same thing to all the other dominant checks or stripes. If you've got stripes, maybe you could do every 3 or 4. When we get to the dot, we do the same thing, but match that seam junction with the long side like that. Okay, so you'll be able to match this first section, and then after you've pivoted, it may sort of match here because we've changed the angle. So when you're sewing the seam, sew over the pin really carefully and slowly, and then that'll stop the fabric shifting when you're stitching the seam. The third piece is sewn on in exactly the same way, except at the top, don't stitch over the previous seam allowance. It's helpful to put a pin at the seam junction at the top, and then just here, and that's where you can start. Plunge your machine needle down into that spot so you're starting in exactly the right place, and then whip out the pin, and then it's sewn in just the same way. Come down, pivot at the dot, snip, turn, and finish at the dart. We now have the beret in 2 halves like this, and when you press these, press them over a tailor's ham or something so you can just isolate the part you're pressing, the part that you're pressing. Press these seams that way so they look like that until you get to the pivot point. When you press the bottom section of that seam, let me show you here, there's the dart, press it away from the dart. So you might or might not need to change direction at that pivot point. For one of them you will, and the other one you won't. We're now going to sew the two halves of the beret together. And we're going to do it by matching the junction at the top like this and starting just before the junction and sewing. And that way, if you don't quite get the junction spot on, you've just got a little section to unpick, because you'll be stitching it in two halves. You'll be stitching from here to the end and then here to the end. So let's match the junction first with a pin. I'll put it through here and then match it to here. Okay, so I will begin stitching. Just before this, I'll go very carefully over the pin to make sure I get this junction matched, and then the rest of the seam is just the same as all the others. Here we are stitched, and I'm happy to report junction perfection. And now what I'm going to do is flip this over and stitch this seam, and that's the last one. Here it is, all stitched and finished. You'll need to definitely press this seam with a ham underneath it, because now it's hat shaped. And this seam you've just stitched, press it open so that it's not so bulky at the top here. Press it open all the way to the pivot point, and then press this to one side, the opposite side to the dart, just like you did before. If you like to put a label on things you make, do this now on the lining, either like this or like this, or if it's the kind that you fold in half and insert into a seam, just undo a little section of dart or a bit of seam and then insert that in there and resew. You may not do it if you have a reversible hat, or you might like to anyway. We are back in the bathroom now to check the fit. So slip your lining into the main and match the raw edges together so that you can try it on. Oops. Okay. Note that when you have the binding on, it will firm up a little around your head. But what we are mainly concerned about with this is if it is too tight. So if that's the case with you, take a look at your darts and seams and release a few to make it a bit looser around your head. If you feel it's too loose, you remember you can add a ribbon threaded through the binding at the end, and that will bring it in a bit. It's time to join the outside of the hat with the lining at the top, and this helps keep the lining in place inside the hat. So just match up the seam you pressed open on each like this, and then we're just going to match up these seam allowances and then just stitch backwards and forwards a little bit on your machine, or do a few strong hand stitches, and that will be enough to hold it. Now that you've joined this up at the top, I'm just going to sit one inside the other like this and machine baste these raw edges together all the way around. And pin it first, but just make sure that you're following the right seams. So put this junction together there, and then work your way around. Here I am pinned and ready to sew. These junctions don't particularly have to match this because they're separated by binding, so make it fit evenly all the way around. And when you sew, if you've got one of these, if one of your fabrics is more stable than the other one, put the stable one uppermost to sew and the least stable one underneath, and that will help the machine feed it through. When you've finished stitching these together, go through with a pair of scissors and just clean up this edge. Cut off all these triangle-y bits and any frayed bits of fabric, and then you've got a lovely clean edge to put your binding on. For the hat's binding, you have the choice of using purchase bias binding, which is 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters wide, and in Australia this is sold as hem facing. Or you can use a strip of fabric cut on the bias at 4.5 centimeters wide. By the way, this fabric that I'm using for mine is actually quilting cotton, but I found that the easiest binding is actually linen, and this was the easiest to put on and the easiest to make look good. So if you've got some strips of linen, I highly recommend. Whichever binding you use, iron it in half with the wrong sides together first, like this, or like this, to give you a crease, and it makes it much easier to put on. We're going to sew the binding to the edge of the hat, and I'm going to start by showing you if you're using purchase bias binding. So start wherever you like, but if you've stitched a label in somewhere, start there so you've got the join of the binding at the back. Fold back about 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, and with purchase bias binding, see this crease here, sit that at about the 1 centimeter mark. Pop some pins in, so that crease is 1 centimeter down from your raw edge. See how I've got pins in the crease? Now bring that over and see if it completely encases the edge or if it needs to be shifted closer to the raw edge. I think it needs to be shifted closer. I think it needs to come up a tiny bit. Like this. If I bring that over, that will completely cover it on the other side. So I would do that all the way around, and then when I come back to the other side, I would cut off the excess and fold over another 1.5. If you're using a strip like I am, same idea, fold over 1.5 centimeters and make that the beginning, and just match your raw edges all the way around and stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance back to around here where you'll have a folded over section just the same as at the start. Here I am all stitched. Just check on the inside to make sure that you didn't catch any lining in that seam, and then bring this up, and you can give this a press to get a nice crisp fold and bring it over. And then you've got two options. You can either do a fold like this and bring it over and stitch invisibly by hand, or you can bring it slightly over that stitching and pin in the ditch and then stitch it in the ditch, and so you'll end up with an invisible finish on this side and a line of stitching on this side. I'm going to stitch in the ditch. If your hat is reversible, you'll need to make it equally as neat on each side. Here's mine all pressed and pinned, ready to stitch in the ditch. And you can see I've put the pins in the ditch, and on the other side you can see there's a little margin here so that it will catch when I stitch. And here it is all stitched. Some tips for stitching in the ditch is have everything pressed and pinned before you start, and when you begin, plunge the needle down in the ditch so you're starting off in the right place. And you might need to change your thread colour, and I did that for this. I used red for the top. Can you just see my red stitches there? And I used black for the back, for the bobbin rather. Try your hat on and see if you need to thread ribbon through the binding to fine-tune the fit. And I've tried mine on and I do, and so I've got some 1/4 inch ribbon to thread through. You can thread it through with a safety pin on the end of the ribbon, but it's really difficult. I find it hard because it's quite thick in some places. So I have found the best tool is this. It's called an easy threader or EZ threader, and you just thread this through first. Like this. I'm nearly through. Here I am at the other end. Okay, and then just put your ribbon through the hole, and then just slide it out. And it's quite quick. And then you just need to try it on and tie the ends together. I did a knot and a bow for mine, and then trim to fit. You may also like to put a large button or a pom-pom on the top of your beret. I'm going to use a pom-pom on mine to go like this. I didn't do a perfect junction here, but it doesn't matter because the pom-pom will hide it. I was hoping to find a binding colour in cerulean blue to match the pom-pom, but I think black will be fine. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed sewing your beret, and I hope you will enjoy wearing it even more. If you are stuck with anything or you have a question, don't be a stranger. Drop me an email or send me a message on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you, and I'm here to help. Bye for now.